The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. Robert Cummings holds a master's in professional engineering license and is an experienced professional advancing sustainability in the industrial sector for over 30 years. He is currently heading up sustainability, environment, and public affairs for Lafarge Eastern Canada. Lafarge is Canada's largest provider of sustainable construction materials and a member of the global group Holcim. With 6,000 employees and 350 sites across Canada, Lafarge Canada's mission is to provide construction solutions that build progress for people and the planet. He leads a team of dedicated sustainability professionals, champions decarbonization projects, advances public policy towards green procurement and carbon pricing systems, and instills ESG principles in an industrial sector. Now let's get into the episode with Robert.
Welcome back, John. We are missing our good friend and executive producer, Lysandra, so that means we can play as long as we want without her here.
I'm not sure that's the way we should put it, but it's really good to be back.
Fair enough. And listen, we are so lucky to have Rob Cummings with us. Rob is head of sustainability and public affairs at Lafarge Canada. And he's encouraging, I looked at his LinkedIn profile, and he's encouraging people to talk to him about decarbonization, biodiversity, and governance. And lucky us, we have a chance to actually talk to him about that today. So Rob, welcome, and thank you so much. We know, as John and I have done some work in the cement industry, it's a critical industry going forward, and certainly a very important one in this whole decarbonization piece. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, David and John. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, this should be a little bit of a barn burner. I'm looking forward to it as well. Rob, if you could just introduce Lafarge as a company and your work in the company, would you be able to do that for us?
Oh, absolutely. So Lafarge Canada has been around since the 1970s. We're currently a member of the Holcim Group, which is a Swiss-based company. We have different brands worldwide. We also have a brand called Geocycle, which is a waste management company. And Holcim Elevate is a roofing company. It's all part of the Holcim Group. So in Canada, we've got East and West Canada. I'm in East Canada. Our head office is in Toronto, which is where my empty office is.
Really good. And your role, what is your role in the organization?
Yeah, a lot of people ask that of me. So obviously I'm the head of sustainability and public affairs, and I think the two go together very well, and I explain more about that. So environmental compliance, government relations, stakeholder management, permitting, strategies around decarbonization, circularity, managing our Eastern Canada reporting systems for ESG purposes as part of the Holcim Group, managing our corporate social responsibility system. So all those things are all somehow interrelated, and it's actually a great job. I've been enjoying it for many, many years.
Okay, Rob, thank you for that. So my question sort of follows on from that, and it's how can public affairs and sustainability motivate and create movement within your company? So I'm guessing really the question is, how does what you're doing improve Lafarge's sustainability rating?
Sure. So obviously the reporting piece is pretty basic. That's accounting mixed with engineering, which is kind of a unique combination. Where I think that a good sustainability person can make the biggest difference, and this is why I think public affairs and sustainability go together so well. It's finding partners. It's working with our government partners to change the rules. So one quick example of that, if you look at excess soil from a construction site, you might be thinking, why is he talking about excess soil from a construction site? But there was a time when it was the Wild West. The trucks would show up, the soil would disappear. And what that meant was that potentially contaminated soil was going to places it ought not to go to. And it was impossible for responsible operators like ourselves to get a business out of this, right? Because we need soil for rehabilitation of our quarries. We have our construction customers have excess soil as they excavate to put a basement in or whatever it might be. you think there'd be an opportunity there, but it didn't work until the rules changed. Suddenly, the owner of the property had to ensure that the soil was clean, there's records kept, the tracking where the trucks are going now. Suddenly, those customers look at us as a responsible way to comply with those new rules, and we have a business going out of it. So that's a perfect example where we need to change the rules. So other rule changes that we've worked on are the cap and trade systems, carbon pricing systems for our cement plants. That's more carrot than stick, which is great. So we can justify investments now that we could not have been justified earlier. So those are two examples where by changing the rules, we can make it possible to be profitable in doing our sustainability programs. We are not a company that will do things just for the sake of marketing. If it's not profitable, it's not sustainable. Plain as that.
Yeah, that's an interesting view, isn't it? And I think I can remember a long time ago, I worked with a company that had a very, should we say at the time, green approach to things. And I can remember talking to them, and it was a case study for the UK government. And they basically said, yeah, we do sustainability issues, we do campaigning, we do a whole range of things. But if we don't make money, we can't do any of those. We're not a charity. We're not in it for that. And I think that's an important message, isn't it? But can I just say, I think the important message is you can do that and be profitable. Whereas we got a lot of people are saying, oh, all this ESG rubbish, all this is just adding a cost to the business.
And that's what people think, and they're wrong. Right?
Yeah.
It's really looking at things through a new lens, and you discover ways of making money while also doing really good for people and the planet. If you start to look at it through a different lens, which is sort of from my role as a advocate for people on the planet, and also as a influencer with my company, that's kind of one of the things I work on daily.
Yeah. Thank you.
Rob, we're going to talk about decarbonization strategies, and it's our understanding Lafarge Canada has been a leader in decarbonization efforts. And I wonder if you could share with us some of the innovative strategies and technologies your team is using to reduce carbon emissions in your operations.
Oh, absolutely. I always love an opportunity to brag about what we're doing. So I'll try to keep it brief. But, really all of our companies in our industry are actively working on this because very good business reason here is that if you're an investor looking at our industry, you're looking at the amount of CO2 we produce in terms of CO2 per kilograms of CO2 per dollar revenue. And you're looking at carbon pricing up to $170 in Canada by 2030. You're looking at the cost of CCS systems. It's scaring investors away. So we have a business drive to decarbonize, and we've been very, very effective. We actually have had a 25% reduction in our carbon intensity in the last 2 years alone by 2030 with projects that we have on the books. So not just ambition, but based on projects that are already laid out, we're going to achieve a 40% reduction in our carbon intensity in Eastern Canada by 2030. So what kinds of things are we doing? Obviously, there's energy efficiency. That's always a good one because there's always less energy, less cost, right? We're switching some of our fossil fuels. Our industry has been a big coal and petcoke user.
Oh, yeah.
So as we switch to fuels derived from, in some cases, our construction demolition. So think 2x4s, think all those combustible materials that are all lower carbon than coal, by the way, that we can process into a fuel, which is what our company Geocycle does. And we can place easily 30-40% of our fuel, and with additional technical investment, we think we can get close to 100% replacement. So 1/3 of our CO2 emissions comes from our use of fuel. So that solution is to gradually replace it more and more with lower carbon alternatives. Natural gas is an easy fit. But let's see where carbon pricing, the rule changes I talked about, comes into play. For example, natural gas has historically been higher priced than coal. They did some math once. You wouldn't believe this, but if you look at dollar per energy units, whatever energy unit you want to look at, the equivalent in terms of cents per liter of gasoline was like 15 to 20 cents per liter. Is what coal costs for that energy delivery. That's a delivery cost. So it's tough to find something lower cost than that. So natural gas has always been a bit higher, but with carbon pricing, it's starting to equalize and often is lower cost, right? So I like to think of it three ways. There's things we can do as our own company with investment in known technology, right? Very straightforward. There's things we can do with partners where they have their technology they bring to us. Very straightforward. Like in Europe, we just bought 500 electric ready-mix trucks. So that's with a partner. Then we get to things where the rules need to change in order to get that next reduction. And that's where a lot of my government relations work is these days, working with standards bodies, whatever it might be. And the final bucket is reductions we can accomplish with our customer. And to be clear, I mean their customer. And that kind of conversation is starting to happen with some of the leading developers and construction management firms out there. But those are really the steps we need to do. So as I said, we've already accomplished a 25% reduction. That 40% reduction is based on things we can do ourselves and with known partners. But to get beyond that, to get to like a 2/3 reduction in carbon intensity, we need our construction partners. Then there's that last 1/3, that last devil of 1/3. That's very, very difficult to manage because 2/3 of our CO2 emissions comes from taking limestone, heating it up to a high temperature with fossil fuels, dries off the CO2 molecule, you end up with CaO or lime, and then with other materials, it becomes clinker, which becomes cement. So that's a tough one. That's why we're known as a hard to abate sector. But we have to do something because worldwide we represent 8% of the world's CO2 emissions. It's not because concrete is particularly carbon intensive. It's not compared to other building materials. It's just there's so friggin' much of it, and which is good for our industry. But, with a New York City being built every month, with 1 million people coming to Canada last year, you can see there's a lot of concrete, think basements, think condo towers, hospitals, universities, think bridges, roads. It all adds up to it's the second highest consumed material in the world, second only to water. So I like to talk about squaring the circle, and I will stop talking after this because I've gone on. But we need affordable housing. People need places to live. And concrete's very resilient. We know we're going to need more concrete with climate change happening. At the same time, it's carbon intensive, and we have to work around that issue. We've got to find a way to affordably reduce our carbon emissions, and that's where I think innovation comes in.
Fair enough. Just for our listeners, you talked about CCUS. That's carbon capture, utilization, storage. Just for people who may not know, we use a lot of buzzwords, think that everyone knows what we're. So I just wanted to make sure.
We love our acronyms, don't we?
Yeah, no, we're pretty good at it in our industry. And Rob, just to follow up, because we did a webinar last week in regards to the construction industry and now some of the municipalities with the bylaws and requirements. So they're now requiring customers to be net zero, not only in the operational piece, but in embodied carbon. So I can understand the pressure that is going on in your industry, and it's obviously impacting you folks as well. So I have a statement or a question for you though. Like how can you compare yourself, Eastern Canada, to the rest of Lafarge's operations? What makes you different, or what drives you differently besides, regulations in other markets? Are you truly ahead of some other jurisdictions in North America in the work that Lafarge is doing?
Good question. Obviously, Europe started 10 years ahead of us.
Sure.
Very aggressive decarbonization strategies, very robust governance structures and funding programs. A lot of innovation work is being done there. They've had carbon pricing for a very long time. But if I look at the U.S., obviously Biden's Inflation Reduction Act is going to have a huge impact. It's probably I hear it's the world's largest decarbonization strategy ever. So very significant. However, the disadvantage in my mind that they have in the US is they don't have a carbon pricing system.
Right.
So that means they've not, you're a cement plant owner in the US. You're reporting CO2, but you're reporting it for the sake of reporting. There's no value associated with it. Whereas for us, it's got dollars associated. A 1% mistake is, could be $1 million. So that gives us a lot of focus. We've had more time to develop some of the reporting governance around that in Canada. But most importantly, we have a way of monetizing any investments that reduce carbon. If you look at the sky as a big landfill for toxic gases, which is not the way to look at it, but that's essentially what it is. And no one owns the sky. And it's what's called an externality when you look at market systems. If you internalize those externalities, I think the market system will do its magic and drive investment to address it. So that's why I think carbon pricing for heavy industry is so critical. Every one of our plants in Canada has a carbon pricing system, whether it's cap and trade or output-based pricing. That gives us that incentive. On one hand, it's a small stick and a big carrot if we can reduce.
Fair enough. Thank you for that. John, another client talking how market pricing can actually drive people's efficiency, right?
Yeah, it's interesting on that because no names, no pack drill, as they say, but I do know of some certain, should we say, large global operators who are introducing carbon pricing internally where there isn't an external one because they know it's going to come and they want to future-proof their investments to be ready for when carbon pricing does occur in the jurisdiction. So, and I think we'd all agree on this call, wouldn't we, that it's going to happen. Carbon is going to become increasingly a commodity and one that you have to factor in. Okay, I've been really comfortable with talking about cement and energy efficiency and carbon and all that. And then my question comes on to biodiversity. And I'm going to be slightly devil's advocate. What's the point of biodiversity if how do you make money out of that? I'm not really sure I understand how it all fits in. I'm being slightly flippant there, but you clearly are a champion for biodiversity. So could you tell us, why businesses should be doing it and what Lafarge is doing about it?
Well, actually, I think we need to be doing more. This is one area where I think there's a lot of work to be done. So the issue, why biodiversity? Where'd that come from? Why is it even being discussed today? It's because, if you look at concrete, just so you know, concrete and cement are different. So concrete is made up of cement, stone, sand, and gravel. Okay? All of those are aggregates. They're all from quarries, dotted all across the provinces in Canada and through the US states as well. Every time you're having to rip up natural areas in order to get at the reserves underneath. So that's where our biodiversity impact comes from, that we're essentially tearing down forests in some cases, meadows in other cases. Now, the good news is at the end of the time when we're done, we are restoring and rehabilitating. So we're bringing back some of that biodiversity. So one of our objectives is to be biodiversity net positive so that through the operating life of our quarries, we're doing things on our own properties to enhance biodiversity so that on balance, we're positive. We're adding, all the additions and subtractions. So that's why biodiversity is part of our discussion. It has to be, especially with the recent requirements for disclosure of nature-based risks that are coming our way as part of ESG reporting, which we, by the way, were 100% supportive. David Bedford, my CEO, and myself wrote a letter back that COP, I think it's COP 15 for biodiversity in Montreal, in support of mandatory disclosure of biodiversity risks. Because if you follow any of the information on biodiversity, it's scary. The amount of loss of biodiversity throughout and habitat throughout all of our countries is astonishing, and we have to do something about it, and we have to do more. We're not doing enough as Lafarge, as our industry, as Canada. So now, how do you monetize it? No, there's a good question. There are some soft benefits in the sense that, if we're trying to get a new quarry built, and whether the community around that quarry will believe us when we say that we are serious about biodiversity restoration and that we're doing things outside of our properties, which we are, by the way, to enhance biodiversity. We have a good track record that can make a difference in terms of getting licenses, period. But that's a harder pitch to make because it's a soft benefit and it's hard to explain.
Yeah.
I, as a crazy idea that I've been thinking about is, could we have some other kind of trading system for biodiversity as we do for carbon, so that, we can create biodiversity habitats somewhere and use those as credits to compensate. We're sort of doing this already through regulation. Often, if you rip up a wetland in different provinces, you'd have to create 2 wetlands of equal size, that sort of idea. But if we do it through some kind of trading system, I think it would really open up some opportunities. Maybe farmers or whoever could be our partners there. So I think there's ways of changing the rules again to make sustainability profitable.
Yeah, a question following on from that, and again, I'm playing with you just slightly here, but I think an awful lot of people think biodiversity, that's about tigers becoming extinct, having no elephants, and taking down the Amazon forest. But I think they forget, actually, biodiversity is actually on your doorstep as well, isn't it?
Yes, we have this. People can look this up. It's called the Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System, BEARS, as we call it. It's not the alcohol; it's an acronym, and it's under the International Union for Conservation of Network of Nature (IUCN) website. So you can look that up, and it's a methodology to assess biodiversity. And what struck me when I was instructed in how to use this tool is that it's not just animals. You're looking at different kinds of trees, insects, marshlands, wetlands, riverbeds. All these things are part of that assessment process. And it's, these things are all interlinked, right? If you have even a taller grass, it gives mice a chance to hide from the hawks, that sort of thing. It's fascinating. Once we get out and doing these kinds of things, it's a lot of fun to be out in the sunshine and in nature. But yes, I think it's a challenge, and we need to work together again to change the rules to make biodiversity profitable.
Yeah, it's interesting your point about how spread it is. One of the issues in Europe, UK, is bees, because bees are pollinators, and what we're doing to biosystems is that we are making them bee unfriendly, and then suddenly people don't realise how critical they are. And I think this point about the interconnectivity of living, growing things is the difficult thing. And we know in climate change, the polar bear sitting on an ice floe has been a wonderful piece of imagery, but a little bee buzzing around is actually probably potentially more impact on all of us. And perhaps there's a big education piece here. Perhaps there is. Dave, over to you.
Yeah, so this podcast is about sustainability, and certainly John and I are very big on the E, because that's our field, environment, and on the energy side. But governance plays a significant role in sustainability. And I know I've just a question for you, Rob, is how does Lafarge and Canada integrate governance principles into their sustainability and public affairs?
Yeah, that's, it's eyes start to glaze when we say the word governance. It's the G in ESG. But if you secretly say to yourself, anti-greenwashing, it suddenly makes a lot of sense, right? So if somebody wants to buy a green bowling ball or whatever it might be, and without some kind of governance systems in place to ensure that the bidders are all using the same rules and counting as accurately as possible and as recently as possible, you're not going to get what you paid for. You're going to pay for the marketing, not for the actual delivery of a low carbon good. So Our industry needs to work on this to some extent. For the fellow nerds out there, the product category rules, PCR, another acronym, is probably the way to fix a lot of the issues because they need to be tightened up. Because if you look at the rules for environmental product declarations, nerding out again, apologies for that. EPDs, they specifically say in the ISO standard they're not to be used for commercial purposes. So we really don't have any commercial ready systems to have good competition on low carbon products and services. And that competition is so important because I think the one of the big paths forward here is innovation, and market systems can drive innovation faster than anything else at a lower cost. It is the way forward, but we need to get the governance in place. So our industry, for example, is we're not going to wait in Canada. We're already going ahead as a group of players in Canada, creating an almost like a super PCR for product category rules. You need to use last year's accredited third-party review emission reporting, right? You can't use 5 years ago. You can't use industry average anymore if you're going to be bidding. You've got to have something that's project specific. So there's a lot of data tracking of trucks from one site to another, and where do you pull the gravel from, and when was the cement produced? Lots of transportation logistics issues, requires data tracking. So, it's going to take some time, but we'll get there in relatively short order so that we can be delivering almost by each truck. We can give you a report on how many kilograms of CO2 were emitted in the production of that 1 cubic meter of concrete. And that's when we're able to, if you're a builder, you can basically now know exactly how much embodied carbon you need. And then, like another governance example, I'm trying to make it sound less boring. I'm not sure I'm working.
No, you're doing great.
Oh, thank you. We'll see. The city of Toronto is doing something really interesting with their green building standard, which requires that you offset all of the embodied carbon, right? So this is what I just said is, if we can be delivering much more accurate numbers, I think our builders will be happy to see they're buying fewer offset credits somewhere. And I would even dare say that we're looking at a system called book and claim. I won't get into it in more detail, but it's if in the construction sector we could have offsets that are in our sector, I think that's a big step forward for buildings, green buildings, is those offsets shouldn't be something from another country. They should be in the building sector itself. You can be paying offsets for lower carbon products. And again, it's another trading system, which I think will drive a lot of that innovation.
It's interesting that you touched on offsets there under the heading of when we're looking at governance. And I was reading an article, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, about a large number of carbon credit, carbon offset scams, bad actors that there are out there. We clearly, it's an area, I don't know where you stand on this, Rob, but I think people we've had on this podcast all agree to get to net zero for 2050, there will have to be some degree of offsetting. It probably can't be all done. If we take that as a premise, we then need good quality offsets. And I just wonder, as a representing quite a big player in terms of carbon, what's your view on the governance of offsetting?
I think there has been some mistakes made for sure, and it's given it a bad name. And I think there are some people out there that are using that bad name to just discredit the whole system for various cultural or political reasons. Okay. But absolutely, I just am such a believer in the power of markets to drive change. We just see it in our economy, right? Free markets are really, we see a lot of economic development, a lot of innovation at the lowest cost possible. So they are in our future. A lot of work has been done that's not getting any airplay to increase the reliability and governance and transparency around offsets. There's banks involved to ensure offsets. There's all sorts of trading systems out there. So I think it's a lot of set markets. It's a huge topic. In fact, there are some companies that are it's a market of one where they will actually pay another company to do a project that reduces carbon and one-on-one, right? So more, not quite charity, but it's kind of, out of
Yeah.
more green marketing. I think that they do those sorts of things because not the prices they're paying are not sustainable, but they are good seed funders, almost like angel investing through another route is what those look like. If you're paying $500 per ton of CO2 abatement, you're doing that to basically seed a new technology, doing that on a long-term basis. But I
Yeah.
think carbon trading systems, whether they're compliance-based or even offsets ones, the more it is regulated by governments, by the way, the better. None of the two provinces in Canada that allow offsets today are Alberta, and Alberta has to be offsets in Alberta, and Quebec, because it's part of the California market, has the
Yeah.
use of offsets.
Yeah.
But there are like all sorts of innovators are out there that could monetize their carbon reduction through an offset trading system. They can't do it today. And
Right.
that's where the problem is, right? We need all hands on deck. We need a way to monetize carbon savings. And that's why I'm a big believer in the long-term viability of offset markets.
Thanks for that, Rob. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of our time on this podcast, which that I now have to ask you that question. What's the biggest takeaway for our listeners from this podcast?
Sustainability has to be profitable to be sustainable, full stop. And the way to do that, or to change the rules by which we all play, to make sustainability the profitable answer.
Nice. Complete. We know where we are with that. Dave, what's your takeaway?
That's really well stated, Rob. I actually liked every part of that. I think I'm just going to add, because we see this often, we'll see sometimes sustainability people run in silos, but you had noted that a variety of things have to be involved, from accounting to rules and regulations to engineering. Like, it's a wide spectrum. And I think what you described actually it's just a new way of doing business, and a variety of people in the business have to be involved in actually making it happen. And there's nothing better than good pricing signals to demonstrate to you that this is actually a great business thing to do. So I captured that from our discussion today. John, how about you?
I'm going to say I was going to pick up. I'm going to pick up on two things. I'm going to be cheeky. I'm going to have two, but one of them is, Rob, you said make money and do good, and I think that's quite a good takeaway. But I was playing around on the biodiversity thing, and I didn't realise, and I'm impressed by your commitment to become biodiversity net positive, and I think that is a really interesting thing, because the minerals industries, the cement industry are often seen to be savaging the environment, and to actually do that is quite interesting. I did some work here in the UK with the Mineral Products Association, and they said that they were the only industry, acronym warning, one coming up, introduced new triple SIs into the environment. Now, in this, a site of special scientific interest is a triple SI. Yeah. And this was to do with when you've got a quarry, for example, and it's come to end of life, you make something out of it. You make a lake, you make a pond, you grow trees, and in fact you put back more than was there when you stripped the overburden and started digging the hole. So I think that's really interesting, and perhaps we need more industries to commit to a balance on biodiversity, because I don't think there's any industry that doesn't have an impact on biodiversity. And so that's been a bit of an eye-opener for me to think about that today. So thank you.
So that concludes our first podcast with Rob. We have a second podcast. The first podcast was obviously based on sustainability. Stay tuned to our listeners. You'll hear the second podcast on circular economy and community engagement. Rob, I want to thank you for today, and we'll look forward to our second podcast.
Thank you, thanks, Rob.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.